Welcome to the Honeyed Leaf, where every cup of tea comes with a story. I'm so glad you're here. If you enjoy gentle mysteries that help you sleep, please subscribe so you never miss a visit to Willowbrook. Tonight, we're returning to the peaceful village, where Clara Whitmore is about to find herself drawn into another gentle mystery. Before we begin, find a comfortable position, close your eyes if you'd like, and let yourself relax. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do. Just let the story carry you peacefully towards sleep. Now, let's visit Willowbrook together. Chapter 1. The piano arrives. The village hall in Willowbrook was a solid, well-loved building on the edge of the green, used on Mondays for yoga, Tuesdays for the reading group, Thursdays for the over-60s lunch club, and Saturdays for whatever the village happened to need that week. It smelled pleasantly of wood polish and old curtains and the particular mix of activities that had taken place there over many decades. It was, in every sense, the heart of village life. On a Wednesday morning in October, Pat, the village hall caretaker, arrived at 8:30 to set up chairs for the Thursday lunch club. She unlocked the double doors, propped them open, picked up her clipboard, and walked into the main hall. Then she stopped. In the centre of the hall, positioned with great care on the polished floorboards, was a piano. A beautiful, upright, walnut-cased piano that had absolutely not been there on Tuesday evening. Pat walked around it slowly. It was a real piano. Not a keyboard, not an electronic instrument, but a proper upright with ivory and ebony keys and brass pedals, and the warm, resonant smell of old wood and felt. It was in excellent condition, polished, tuned, the keys clean and unchipped. A small bench sat in front of it, also walnut, also clearly part of the same piece. It looked, in every way, as if it had always belonged exactly where it was. There was no note, no label, no delivery slip, no indication whatsoever of who had brought it, where it had come from, or why it was here. Pat checked the back door, locked as she'd left it. The side windows closed, latched. The only way in or out of the village hall was through the front double doors, which she had unlocked herself this morning. She looked at the piano. The piano looked back at her, serene and entirely unhelpful. She did what anyone in Willowbrook did when something unusual happened. She called Margaret at the post office. Margaret was the village's unofficial information centre, and while she had not personally arranged any piano deliveries, she felt the situation warranted immediate attention and said so. Within 20 minutes, she had also called David at the bakery, Tom Fletcher, and Mrs. Pembroke, who arrived at the village hall within the half hour, all of them slightly out of breath. They stood in a semicircle around the piano and regarded it with the mixture of delight and bewilderment that tends to accompany genuinely unexpected things. Mrs. Pembroke touched one of the keys. A single clear note rang out through the hall. Warm, resonant, perfectly tuned. They all looked at each other. "Well," said David, who was still holding the bread he'd been wrapping when Margaret called. "Someone certainly knows what they're doing." By mid-morning, half the village knew about the piano. By lunchtime, the other half had found out. The village hall saw a steady stream of curious visitors through the afternoon, people stopping in on their way to and from the shops, each one walking around the piano, pressing a key or two, shaking their heads with pleased bewilderment, and asking the same questions. Where had it come from? Who had brought it? And why, of all places, here? Clara heard about it from Tom Fletcher, who came into the Honeyed Leaf at 11 o'clock looking cheerful. "Have you seen the piano?" he asked, before he'd even sat down. Clara had not. She went to the village hall at lunchtime, when the stream of visitors had thinned slightly, and stood in front of the instrument for a long moment. It was a beautiful thing, not ostentatious, not grand, but quietly and completely lovely. She played a single scale. The tone was extraordinary. She looked at it carefully. The walnut case was old, but impeccably maintained. The brass pedals were polished to a warm gleam. There was a maker's mark on the inside of the floorboard, a small oval stamp with a name she didn't recognise, and a date, 1923. A 100-year-old piano in perfect condition. Someone had loved this instrument for a very long time, and they had brought it here, in the middle of the night, and left it without a word. Clara opened her notebook. A piano did not arrive in a village hall by accident. It was large, heavy, and required professional moving equipment or several strong people. This was not spontaneous. Someone had planned it, arranged it, and carried it out carefully enough to leave no trace beyond the instrument itself. She wrote, "Who brought the piano?" Underneath, "Who does it belong to?" Underneath that, "Why here and why now?" She began with the practical question. How had it got in? The village hall had 3 entry points: the front double doors, the side fire door, and the back service door. All had been locked when Pat arrived. Either the person had a key or returned it after leaving, or someone had let them in before Pat arrived. Clara visited Pat and asked about spare keys. Pat kept a master set. Gerald Webb had a set, and one further set was kept in a lockbox at the post office. Margaret confirmed that the emergency key set was present and accounted for in the lockbox. The village committee chair was a man named Gerald Webb, who lived on Church Lane, and who, when Clara visited him, was entirely mystified by the piano, and produced his key set immediately to demonstrate he had not lent them to anyone. "If I'd known someone was bringing a piano, I'd have helped," he said, looking genuinely regretful. "I've always thought the village hall needed one." So the entry remained a mystery. For now. Clara shifted her attention to the piano itself, the maker's mark from 1923. The model, she had photographed it and looked it up. A Hartley & Sons upright, made in Birmingham, a respected mid-range instrument of its era. Not rare, but not common either. There had been several hundred made, enough that tracing this specific one would require more than a model number. She needed to find a distinguishing detail. Chapter 2. What the piano knew. Clara returned to the village hall the next morning before it opened for the Thursday lunch club. The piano was still there, undisturbed, catching the early light through the east-facing windows. She examined it more carefully this time, opening the top lid, looking at the soundboard, checking the interior. Pianos, she knew, sometimes carried their histories inside them. Tuners left records, restorers left notes, owners sometimes wrote their names. On the inside of the top panel, in the upper left corner, she found what she was looking for. Not a name, a sticker, small and slightly faded, the kind that piano teachers and music schools used for record keeping. It read, Willowbrook Music Society, 1987. Clara straightened up slowly. The piano had been in Willowbrook before. It had belonged at some point to an organisation called the Willowbrook Music Society. She had never heard of it, but someone had. She photographed the sticker and went directly to Edith Marsh on Mill Lane. Edith, 91, sharp-minded and encyclopedic about village history, was at her window as usual and waved Clara in before she had reached the garden gate. "The piano," Edith said before Clara had sat down. "I wondered when you'd come. I've been thinking about it since yesterday." Clara settled into the chair. "Tell me about the Willowbrook Music Society," she said. Edith's face lit up in the way it did when she was called upon for information she was pleased to have. "The Music Society. Now there's a name I haven't heard in a long time. It was active in the 80s and into the 90s. A small group, 12 or 15 members at its height. They met in the village hall on Friday evenings. Played together, organised concerts, that sort of thing. They had a piano. I heard it sometimes, walking past on Friday nights." "What happened to the society?" Clara asked. "It wound down gradually," Edith said. "The way these things do. People moved away, got busy. The Friday evenings became less regular and then stopped. By the mid-90s it was over. I'm not sure what happened to the piano." She paused. "The driving force behind it was a young woman, very talented. She played everything, piano, violin, even the oboe." Clara leaned forward. "Do you remember her name?" "Harriet," Edith said. "She lived here for a few years in the 80s, rented a cottage on Briar Road. Then she moved away to study music professionally. She must have been in her 20s then." She looked at Clara. If the piano belonged to the Music Society, and Harriet was the heart of the Music Society, it seems reasonable that the piano went with her when she left. "And came back with her," Clara said. Edith's eyes brightened. You think she's returned? I think someone brought that piano here deliberately, Clara said. Someone who knew the village hall, someone who knew the piano had a connection to Willowbrook, someone who had a key or knew how to get one. She paused. The piano came back. I think it's very possible the person who brought it did too. She left Edith's cottage with the name Harriet and a decade, the 1980s, and the sense that she was looking for someone who had been part of Willowbrook once and had come back, for reasons not yet clear, and announced their return in the most distinctive way imaginable. Not a phone call, not a knock on a door. A piano, placed in the village hall in the middle of the night, perfectly tuned, with no note. That was not the action of a shy person. That was a statement. Clara was intrigued. She went to Margaret at the post office. Harriet, she said. A woman who lived on Briar Road in the 1980s. She would be in her 60s now, probably. She may have returned to the village recently, or she may have passed through. Has anything come in with that name? Margaret thought. Not recently, but a new short-term let started 3 weeks ago. The cottage at the end of Briar Road, number 12. The agent arranged it. I've seen lights on. I don't know the name of the tenant. Briar Road, the same road where Harriet had rented in the 1980s. Clara walked there that afternoon. Number 12 was the last cottage on the lane, stone-fronted, with a yellow door that looked recently painted, window boxes with late-season herbs, and through the front window, visible from the road, a music stand. Clara stopped on the pavement and looked at the music stand for a moment. Then she knocked on the yellow door. Chapter 3, Harriet. The woman who answered was in her early 60s, with short grey hair and the upright posture of someone who had spent decades being conscious of how they held themselves. She was wearing a cardigan with paint on the sleeve and had the slightly distracted expression of someone interrupted mid-thought. She looked at Clara for a moment, then said, "You're from the tea shop." Not a question. Clara smiled. "And you're the one who brought the piano." Harriet, because it was absolutely Harriet, Clara could see it in the flicker of expression, looked at her for a moment, then stepped back from the door. "You'd better come in," she said. "I knew someone would figure it out. I hoped it might take a bit longer, to be honest." She said this with a smile that was rueful and warm in equal measure, and led Clara into a sitting room that smelled of coffee and rosin and had sheet music on every available surface. "You brought the piano," Clara said when they were settled with tea. Not an accusation, just a confirmation. "I did," Harriet said. "I hired a specialist mover, 3 men and a van, 2 o'clock in the morning, because that was the only time I could be confident no one would see. I had a key, an old one, from when I lived here before. I'd kept it all these years without really knowing why." She looked at her tea. "And then suddenly I knew why." "Why did you leave it without a note?" Clara asked. Harriet considered. "Because I didn't know what the note would say. I've been away from Willowbrook for 30 years. I didn't know if anyone would remember me, or the music society, or whether the piano would mean anything to anyone. I thought, if I left it and it was welcomed, then I'd know it was all right to come back properly. And if it wasn't, well, at least the village would have a nice piano." Clara looked at her across the teacups. "You were nervous," she said. Harriet laughed, a genuine, self-deprecating laugh. "Terrified," she said. "Which is ridiculous, I know. I'm 63 years old, I've performed at concert halls, I've taught hundreds of students, and I was absolutely terrified of knocking on a door in a village I lived in 40 years ago." She looked around the small sitting room. "But I wanted to come back. I've wanted to for a long time. I just needed a way to begin. Because it was the best place I've ever lived," she said simply. "I've lived in cities since, good cities, full of music and culture and everything I thought I needed, but Willowbrook was the right size. Everything was the right size here." She looked at the framed photograph on the mantelpiece, the music society, the 80s, a group around a piano. "I spent 30 years thinking about this village. I retired from performing 2 years ago," she continued. "Not unhappily. I had a wonderful career. I'm enormously grateful for it. But when I thought about what I wanted the next chapter to look like, I kept coming back to this village, the green, the market on Thursdays, the way people knew each other." She smiled. "And the village hall on Friday evenings, with a dozen people making music together because they loved it." She paused. I wanted that again. I wanted to start that again. Clara felt the shape of the whole thing settle into clarity. Harriet wasn't just returning a piano she'd taken with her when she left. She was returning herself, and the piano was the way she'd chosen to announce it. A gift first, before an introduction, a gesture before words. Something that said, I was here before, and I cared about this place, and here is something I'm giving back, before the harder conversation of asking whether she could belong here again. His expression did not change. She wants to start the music society again, Clara confirmed. Gerald looked as if Christmas had arrived early. I used to attend, he said. Friday evenings, I played the clarinet, not brilliantly. He paused. But I played. He was already reaching for his phone before Clara had finished her tea. Harriet, when Clara conveyed the committee's welcome and Mrs. Pembroke's proposal, was quiet for a moment. A concert, she said. Her voice had the quality of someone testing an idea to see how it felt. In the village hall. Another pause. Then quietly, yes, I'd like that very much. She looked at the music stand in the corner. Give me 2 weeks to prepare. Chapter 4. The Village Responds. Clara left Harriet's cottage on Briar Road with a lightness in her step that she always felt when a mystery resolved into something better than expected. She had gone looking for the owner of an anonymous piano and found instead a musician coming home, nervous, hopeful, generous enough to give before asking. She walked to the honeyed leaf, made a pot of tea, and thought about how to proceed. Clara visited Gerald Webb that evening. He listened to the whole story with growing delight, leaning forward in his chair, and when she finished he said, She wants to start the music society again. Clara confirmed this. Gerald looked as if Christmas had arrived early. I used to attend, he said. Friday evenings, I played the clarinet. Not brilliantly, but I played. He reached for his phone before Clara had finished her tea. Gerald immediately called an informal committee meeting for the following evening, at which Clara gave a brief account of the situation, leaving out Harriet's nervousness, which felt private, and the committee voted unanimously to welcome the piano, accept it as a gift, and extend a formal invitation to Harriet to come and play whenever she wished. Mrs. Pembroke was at the meeting and took notes with the focused energy of someone who had already begun planning something larger. A concert, Mrs. Pembroke said, before the meeting had properly finished. She should play a concert, in the village hall, open to everyone. Several people looked at her with the polite caution that Mrs. Pembroke's enthusiasm sometimes inspired. We don't know yet if she'd want to, Gerald said carefully. Mrs. Pembroke looked at him. She brought a piano to the village hall at 2 a.m, she said. She wants to play. We simply need to ask. She was, as usual, entirely right. Clara conveyed the committee's welcome to Harriet the following morning, including Mrs. Pembroke's proposal about a concert. Harriet was quiet for a moment. Then she said, A concert. Her voice had the quality of someone testing an idea to see how it felt. In the village hall. Another pause. Then quietly, Yes, I'd like that. I'd like that very much. She looked at the music stand in the corner of the sitting room. Give me 2 weeks to prepare. By the end of the first week, 6 people had come forward with instruments they hadn't played in years. A violin, a flute, Gerald's clarinet, Susan's cello, a recorder that Mrs. Pembroke produced unexpectedly from a drawer, admitting she'd been playing quietly at home for years without telling anyone, and Lily from the farm on the hill, who had been learning guitar for 3 years and was, it turned out, very good. Tom Fletcher came to the honeyed leaf on Friday looking pleased. I hear the piano woman plays the violin too, he said. And the oboe, Clara added. Tom looked impressed. I used to play the flute, he said slightly shyly. Years ago. I still have it somewhere. I don't suppose... I think you should find it, Clara said. Tom looked at her. It's been 20 years. Then it's time, Clara said. Tom went home and, according to Margaret, spent the weekend looking through the attic. By the end of the first week, 6 people had come forward with instruments they hadn't played in years. A violin, a flute, Gerald's clarinet, Susan's cello, a recorder that Mrs. Pembroke produced unexpectedly from a drawer and admitted she had been playing quietly at home for years, but hadn't told anyone, and a young woman named Lily, who worked at the farm on the hill, and who, it turned out, had been learning the guitar for 3 years and was very good. Harriet, when Clara told her, looked moved. 6 people, she said, in 1 week. The village has been waiting, Clara said. They just needed someone to open the door. Harriet looked at the sheet music spread across her sitting room floor. I was so worried no one would remember the music society, she said, or that the people who remembered it would have moved on. She paused. But that's what I'd forgotten about small villages. Things don't disappear here, they just wait. She came to the Honeyed Leaf that Saturday for the first time since arriving in Willowbrook, and Clara introduced her to David, to Margaret, to James at the hardware shop, to Tom, who arrived with the slightly triumphant look of a man who had found his flute and confirmed it was still in working order. Each introduction was warm and easy, the way introductions are when the person being introduced has already given the village a gift, and the village is predisposed to think well of them. Mrs. Pembroke managed to bring Harriet and Gerald together at the Honeyed Leaf on Sunday afternoon, where they discovered a shared memory of a particular Friday evening in 1989, when someone had brought the wrong sheet music and they had spent the entire session improvising. It had turned out to be the best evening the Music Society ever had. They laughed about it for 10 minutes. Clara brought more tea and said nothing. Edith Marsh, who could not easily get to the village hall or the Honeyed Leaf, received a visit from Harriet on Monday afternoon. Clara had suggested this, and Harriet had gone without needing persuading. She spent an hour with Edith, who remembered her from the Friday evenings on the green, the sound of piano drifting out on summer nights. I always thought it a shame when it stopped, Edith said. Harriet looked at her. It won't stop again, she said. I promise. Clara watched all of this with the satisfaction she reserved for cases that resolved not just the question asked, but something larger behind it. She had investigated a mysterious piano and found a musician returning home. But what that musician had set in motion, old friendships reconnected, instruments retrieved from attics, a Friday evening restored, that was not something Clara had arranged. That was Willowbrook, given the right reason. Chapter 5. The First Rehearsal. The first rehearsal of what people were already calling the New Music Society, nobody had officially named it yet, but the name was in use, took place on a Friday evening 10 days before the concert. Harriet had booked the village hall from 6 to 9. Clara arrived at 6:10, ostensibly to drop off a tin of biscuits she'd promised for the interval, really because she wanted to see it begin. The hall was warm and bright, the chairs arranged in a loose semicircle facing the piano. Harriet was already there, seated at the bench, playing scales with the focused ease of someone warming up, her hands moving over the keys as if reintroducing themselves to old friends. Around her, people were unpacking instruments with the particular mixture of confidence and nervousness that comes from doing something you love that you haven't done in a while. Tom had found his flute and had clearly been practicing all week, playing a few phrases quietly, frowning then brightening, finding the sound again. Gerald's clarinet was already assembled, reed in place. Susan the cellist was rosining her bow with the ease of decades of muscle memory. Lily sat to one side with her guitar, looking slightly wide-eyed, but holding the instrument with complete confidence. Harriet called them to attention at 6:30. She stood at the front of the semicircle, with the natural authority of someone who had led ensembles for a career, warm but precise, and introduced herself properly for those who hadn't met her yet. I'm Harriet, she said. I used to live here. I've come back. I'm very glad to see all of you, and I'm very glad to hear all of you. Shall we begin? They played for 2.5 hours, stopping often, laughing frequently, occasionally producing something so unexpectedly beautiful that the room went quiet for a moment before breaking into pleased grins. Clara sat in the back corner with her tea and listened. The piano was the foundation, Harriet's playing steady and warm, the kind that made other people play better. Tom's flute found its voice by the end of the first hour. At the interval, biscuits, tea, animated conversation about a passage that hadn't gone as planned, Clara noticed something. The people in the room were talking the way people talk, when something they'd forgotten they loved has come back. Not nostalgically, not about the past, but in the present tense, about the music they'd just made and what they were going to make. Plans were forming. Suggestions were being exchanged. Gerald, eating a biscuit with the pleased expression of a man whose Friday evenings had been restored to their proper purpose, said to no one in particular, "We should do this every week." Several people agreed immediately. Harriet, standing nearby, caught Clara's eye over the heads of the group. Clara smiled. Harriet smiled back, the smile of someone who had taken a risk and found it landing better than hoped, in the warm and particular way that Willowbrook tended to receive good things. After the rehearsal, when everyone else had gone and the chairs were being stacked, Clara helped Harriet tidy up. They worked in companionable quiet for a few minutes. Then Harriet said, "I was so certain for years that coming back would be a mistake, that it would be smaller than I remembered, that I'd built it up in my mind into something it wasn't." She put a music stand away. "It's not smaller, it's exactly as I remembered." She paused. "Perhaps a little warmer." "Willowbrook does that," Clara said. "It's a place that rewards being paid attention to." Harriet looked around the village hall, the piano gleaming quietly in the corner, the chairs half stacked, the curtains still warm lit from the lights inside. "I should have come back years ago," she said. "You came back when you were ready," Clara said. "That's the right time." Harriet considered this. "The piano came back when it was ready," she said. "I just came with it." Chapter 6, The Concert. The concert was on a Saturday evening in November. Mrs. Pembroke had organised it efficiently, printed programmes, reserved seating for Edith and others who needed chairs near the front, a table at the back with wine, juice and David's baked goods. The village hall was full. Every seat taken, several people standing at the back, marmalade installed on a windowsill and apparently attending. Clara arrived early and helped David set up the refreshment table, watching the room fill with the particular warmth of a Willowbrook occasion. People greeting each other, finding seats together, the low hum of a community that has given itself permission to enjoy something. The piano sat at the front of the hall, lit by 2 standing lamps, looking as if it had always been there. Looking, in fact, as if it owned the place, which in a sense it now did. Harriet came in at 7:10, dressed simply in dark blue, her hair pinned, looking entirely composed in the way that experienced performers look entirely composed, right up until the moment they have to perform, at which point the composure becomes real, because there is nothing left to do but play. She spoke briefly to Gerald and Susan, checked the piano bench height, played a few quiet chords to settle herself. The room gradually quieted. The programme began with a solo piece. Harriet alone at the piano, something Clara didn't know the name of but recognised immediately as very good. A melody that moved like water over stones, unhurried, endlessly varied, filling the hall with a sound that made people lean back in their chairs and let their breath slow. Clara watched the audience. Several people closed their eyes. Several more had the expression of people being reached somewhere beyond words. Then the others joined, Gerald's clarinet, warm and round, winding around the piano melody. Tom's flute, bright and clean, catching the upper harmonics. Susan's cello grounding everything beneath. They played 3 pieces together, the music moving through the room and out through the slightly open side window into the November dark, where a few people who hadn't managed to find seats inside stood listening with their coats pulled close. Nobody left. Lily played a piece on her guitar that she had written herself, which nobody had known until she announced it. The room became very attentive in the way it does when someone young and talented is about to do something brave. The piece was lovely, simple and assured, a melody that seemed to have existed forever, but was being heard for the first time. When it finished, the applause was immediate. Lily went slightly pink and grinned at the floor. Mrs. Pembroke played her recorder. She had mentioned this possibility at the planning meeting, and nobody had known quite what to expect, but what they got was a piece of early music that was perfectly suited to the instrument, and played with such neat, unpretentious skill that the audience applauded with genuine appreciation. Mrs. Pembroke acknowledged this with a brief nod, as if she had known they would, which she probably had. She sat back down and wrote something in her notebook. The concert ended with everyone on stage together, all 6 of the Music Society members and Harriet at the piano, playing a piece that Harriet had arranged specifically for this combination of instruments, which no one had heard before, and which fit them all perfectly. It was not a complicated arrangement. It was a generous one. Room for everyone. Space for each instrument to be heard. The kind of music that made you feel the people playing it liked each other. Which they did. The applause when it finished was long and warm and entirely genuine. Clara clapped with everyone else and looked around at the full, bright room, the faces of people she had known for years, lit up with the particular pleasure of something shared. At the piano, Harriet stood and bowed with the ease of someone who had done this thousands of times and looked out at the audience with an expression that was professional composure and barely concealed joy in exactly equal parts. Afterward, over David's baked goods and wine, the hall filled with the animated noise that follows a good concert. Several people asked Harriet when the next one would be. Several asked about joining the society. A woman Clara hadn't seen before said she had heard the music while driving past on the main road and had pulled over and stood outside to listen. She asked if she could come next time. Harriet said absolutely yes. Clara found a quiet moment with Harriet near the end of the evening, when the crowd had thinned and the room was settling into its post-concert ease. "How do you feel?" she asked. Harriet looked around the hall, the piano, the people still talking in clusters, the programme that Mrs. Pembroke had designed featuring Harriet's name in the same font as everyone else's, which was the right choice. "Like I came home," she said. Exactly like that. Chapter 7. What Music Does. Winter arrived in Willowbrook, with its usual gradual insistence, turning the lime trees gold, and the mornings sharp and the evenings early. The honeyed leaf brought in its winter menu, darker teas, richer biscuits, the smell of cinnamon that belonged specifically to November. And on Friday evenings, the village hall lit up, and music drifted from its windows into the cold dark, and people passing would slow their pace and listen. The Music Society, officially named the Willowbrook Music Society again, which everyone agreed was right, met every Friday through November and December. The core group of 7 grew steadily. By December there were 12, the original 7 plus a teenage boy named Sam, who played trumpet, 2 sisters from Orchard Street who sang, and Henry, who had played double bass for 40 years and heard about the society from his neighbour. Henry's arrival was typical of how the society grew, not through advertisement, but through word of mouth and the simple fact that music travels. People heard the Friday evenings from outside and asked about them. The society did not seek members, it played, and the playing was its own invitation, and the invitation was accepted one by people who had been waiting for exactly this kind of reason. Harriet proved to be an extraordinary leader of the group, patient, precise, genuinely interested in what each person brought, rather than what she wished they could do. She spent extra time with Sam, the teenage trumpeter, who was talented but raw, helping him find a tone that worked with the ensemble, rather than over it. She encouraged Lily to write more original pieces and included them in the programme. She convinced Tom that his flute playing was better than he believed, which was true. Clara attended several Friday evenings over the winter, sometimes staying for the full rehearsal, sometimes dropping in for the last half hour with tea for anyone who wanted it. She was not a musician herself, but she understood enough to know that what was happening in the village hall on Friday evenings was something real, not just pleasant, but meaningful. The kind of thing a village remembered for a long time, the kind of thing that became part of what the place was. She thought about the piano, made in Birmingham in 1923, acquired by the Music Society before 1987, played on Friday evenings through the 80s, then taken away when the society wound down, kept and maintained for 30 years by Harriet through several cities and homes, and then returned, in the middle of an October night, to the hall where it had first been played. 100-year-old piano, back where it belonged. She thought about what it meant to bring something back, rather than just return yourself. Harriet could have arrived quietly, introduced herself at the bakery, built a life without drama. Instead, she had led with a gift, had given the village something beautiful before asking for anything, before asking even to be known. That was a particular kind of generosity. the kind that came from understanding that belonging had to be offered as well as received. She wrote, "This was not a crime, it was a gift, delivered with the particular bravery of someone who wanted to give something back before finding out if they were welcome." The piano came home, Harriet came home, and in their wake, 6 instruments were retrieved from attics. A teenage boy found an ensemble, 2 sisters found a stage, and a man drove 20 minutes every Friday and considered it entirely worth the journey. She added, "The piano came home, Harriet came home, and in their wake, 6 instruments were retrieved from attics and cases and the back of wardrobes and played again after years of silence. A teenage boy discovered an ensemble to grow into. 2 sisters found a stage for voices they'd been using only in private. A man with a double bass found a reason to drive 20 minutes every Friday evening and consider it entirely worth the journey." She paused. Music does that. It gives people a reason. Chapter 8. Spring Concert. The spring concert was planned for April. By February, the society had 16 members and was flourishing. Mrs. Pembroke had taken on the role of secretary with her customary focus and had already produced a spreadsheet of concert dates, rehearsal schedules, and potential guest performers covering the next 18 months. The spring concert would be held outdoors on the village green, weather permitting. The spring concert was to be held outdoors, on the village green, weather permitting. This required the piano to be moved, which required Harriet's specialist movers again, which she arranged without fuss, and Gerald, who had turned out to have a talent for practical logistics that had been waiting for an outlet, coordinated the platform and seating and the rather beautiful string of lights that someone produced from a storage room and which turned out to be exactly the right addition. Clara helped set up on the morning of the concert, carrying chairs from the village hall to the green and arranging them in the arc that Harriet had sketched on a piece of paper the previous week. The green looked lovely in the April light, the lime trees in new leaf, the daffodils on the verge not quite finished, the platform with its piano and its string of lights ready for the evening. Several people stopped to look on their way past and immediately asked what time it started. The evening was mild, which April sometimes managed. People arrived early, filling the chairs and then the grass behind them, spreading blankets, bringing flasks of tea and glasses of wine. Children sat at the front, cross-legged, solemn with the gravity of an occasion. Marmalade appeared from somewhere and installed himself on the platform beside the piano, which Harriet accepted with the ease of a performer who had shared stages with many things over the years. The concert opened with Harriet alone at the piano, the April dusk just softening the light to something gentle, the green quiet around her, the village hall lit behind her. She played something slow and clear that seemed to fit the evening exactly. Not written for it, she said later, but found in it, the way certain music finds certain moments. The children at the front were very still. Several adults were also very still. Even Marmalade, beside the piano, appeared to be listening. Then the full society joined, all 16 of them this time, arranged across the platform, a variety of instruments and ages and levels of experience that somehow added up to something more than the sum of its parts. Sam, the teenage trumpeter, had developed, through the winter's Fridays, into something genuinely impressive. The 2 sisters harmonised so naturally that people near them caught their breath. Henry's double bass anchored everything with deep, quiet authority. Lily played 2 original pieces this time. The first was warm and melodic, like the November piece but more assured. The second was longer and more ambitious. 6 minutes of music that the audience followed with focused pleasure, ending somewhere unexpected and entirely right. When it finished, the applause started, and Lily put her hand over her mouth for a moment, apparently surprised by it, which was very charming. Clara stood at the back of the gathered audience and watched. The lights between the platform posts had come on as the dusk deepened, warm gold against the blue April sky. Music moved through the village air, past the bakery and the post office and the honeyed leaf, past the church and Harriet's yellow-doored cottage on Briar Road, up the lane and over the allotments and into the fields beyond. At some point during the concert, Clara noticed a small figure standing at the very edge of the audience, slightly apart. A girl of about 10, in a coat a size too large, holding something close to her chest. Clara drifted toward her during a pause between pieces. "Are you all right?" The girl held out what she was carrying, a violin, small and old. "I play," she said. "A bit." Clara looked at the violin, then at the stage. "Have you told anyone?" The girl's name was Rosie. She lived on Orchard Street and had been learning violin for 2 years from videos online because there wasn't a teacher nearby. She had stood outside the village hall on 3 separate Friday evenings without going in, not knowing if she was allowed. Clara walked her to Harriet at the interval. Harriet listened, asked her to play a few notes and said, "Fridays at 6. Can you make that?" Rosie could make that. She joined the following Friday, nervous and precise, and by the 3rd week she was visibly relaxing, her sound opening up as it does when a young player finds an ensemble to play in and realises that music is better with other people. Harriet gave her 15 minutes of individual attention each week before the full rehearsal began. Within a month she was playing in the ensemble. Within 2 months she was playing a solo in the rehearsal while everyone else listened. The concert ended with something unplanned. As the final piece finished and the applause faded, Harriet sat back down at the piano and played a quiet melody. After a moment, Gerald's clarinet joined, then Tom's flute, then Susan's cello. One by one, each instrument found its way in until all 16 members were playing together, no sheet music, just following the melody and finding where they each belonged within it. It lasted 4 minutes and was entirely unrehearsed and entirely coherent. When it ended naturally, each instrument arriving at the same quiet resolution almost simultaneously. The silence after it was the kind that means the audience is deciding how to respond to something that surprised them. Then the applause came, warm and long, some of it for the music and some of it for the village itself, which had made this possible. Chapter 9, Where the Music Lives. Harriet renewed the lease on the Briar Road cottage in May, extending it for another year. She did this without making an announcement, but news of it travelled the village in the usual way, and the general response was one of quiet satisfaction. She had come back for a short let and found reasons to stay. Willowbrook received this as the compliment it was. She had, by spring, become thoroughly part of the village in the understated way that suited her. She came to the Thursday market. She was a regular at the Honeyed Leaf, always with sheet music, always with tea, sometimes talking and sometimes working at the corner table, with the absorbed focus of someone for whom music was both work and pleasure, and the line between the two was not important. She and Ruth from the Amber Kitchen had discovered a shared interest in the musical history of the area. Ruth had done some research into folk songs connected to the Cotswolds as part of a project she couldn't quite explain yet, and Harriet had a collection of old recordings that turned out to be exactly relevant. They met on Wednesday afternoons to listen to records and talk about music and local history. Clara thought this was a very good combination of people and said so. The Music Society continued on Friday evenings without interruption. Summer came, and the Friday rehearsals moved outside when the weather allowed, the music drifting from the village hall garden into the warm evening air. New members continued to join, not in a rush, but steadily, 1 or 2 each month, drawn by the Friday evenings and by word of mouth and by the simple fact that the society was known to be welcoming and the music was known to be good. Rosie, who had shown up at the spring concert holding her violin, was by summer one of the most reliable members. She came every Friday without fail, earlier than most, helping set up chairs with the air of someone who has found their place and intends to keep it. She had started proper lessons with Harriet on Saturday mornings, paid for by a small bursary the society had quietly established for young members. Sam, the teenage trumpeter, had by summer developed enough confidence to lead the younger players in informal warm-ups before rehearsals. He was 17, tall, and took his music seriously in the way teenagers do when they find something worth taking seriously. Harriet told Clara she thought he was genuinely gifted and intended to help him apply to music college if that was what he wanted. Clara visited the village hall on a Friday evening in July, when the windows were open and the music was pouring out into the long summer dusk. She stood outside for a few minutes, listening. The sound of 17 instruments and 2 voices moving through a piece she didn't know. Something intricate and flowing, with a clarity that suggested it had been well rehearsed, and a warmth that suggested the people playing it were genuinely glad to be there. Which they were. That was audible. She thought about the October morning when Pat had unlocked the village hall and found a piano where there hadn't been one. The bewilderment of it, the delight, the practical questions, and the richer questions beneath them. Someone loved this village enough to give it a gift. Someone was nervous enough about returning that they led with the gift rather than themselves. Someone had kept a piano tuned and polished for 30 years because they intended to bring it home. She wrote, "The mystery of the silent piano was solved by a maker's mark, a sticker, a 91-year-old woman's memory, and a yellow-doored cottage on Briar Road. The answer was a musician coming home. The gift she left was not the piano itself, though the piano is wonderful. The gift was the reason it gave people to begin." She added, "Harriet brought back a piano, a music society, and a Friday evening the village hadn't known it was missing until it had it again. She brought back Rosie's lessons, and Sam's music college applications, and Tom's flute from the attic, and Gerald's clarinet from wherever it had been waiting. She gave Willowbrook something to listen to. And Willowbrook, as it does with good things, listened. She closed the journal and sat for a moment listening to the street. From somewhere up the road, the village hall, the right direction for it, she could hear the flute. Tom's flute, which had been in an attic for 20 years and was back where it belonged, clear and light and going somewhere with great confidence. She smiled. Some cases ended with problems solved. This one had ended with music started. She thought that was probably the better outcome of the two. Chapter 10. A Year On. A year after the piano arrived, Willowbrook marked the occasion in the way that suited it best, quietly, warmly, and with music. The Music Society planned a special concert for October to coincide with the anniversary. Mrs. Pembroke produced a programme that noted, in small print at the bottom, 1 year since the piano came home. This was felt by everyone to be exactly right and exactly enough. Harriet played the same opening piece from the November concert, the one that moved like water over stones, and it had the quality familiar music has when heard again after a year, both new and known, carrying the memory of the first time alongside all the Fridays since. The audience recognised it after the first few bars, and a warm current moved through the room, and people leaned back in their chairs the way they had the first time. The society played with the ease of a group that had spent a year making music together. Rosie, who had been a nervous 10-year-old on the edge of the audience 12 months ago, played a solo that drew the loudest applause of the evening and appeared to feel this was entirely appropriate, which was very good to see. Sam played a fanfare of his own composition that opened the second half, which was brash and joyful and perfectly suited to a celebration. Lily's contribution was a piece she had been working on since January, longer and more complex than anything she had written before, which Harriet had helped her arrange for the full ensemble. It was about Willowbrook, not literally, not with any explicit reference, but in the way that music written in a place and for a place carries that place inside it. People who heard it said they didn't know quite why it moved them. Clara thought she knew why. It was the sound of somewhere being loved. After the concert, Harriet made a brief speech. She thanked the society, the committee, Mrs. Pembroke by name, which made Mrs. Pembroke write something in her notebook immediately. Then she said, "A year ago I left a piano here without a note. I wasn't sure how it would be received. I want to say now, thank you for receiving it the way you did." She paused, looking around the room. "I plan to stay. I thought, when I left Willowbrook 30 years ago, that I was going somewhere better. I went somewhere good. I had a wonderful career. But I spent 30 years thinking about this village, and eventually I understood. You don't leave somewhere better when you leave a place that suits you. You just leave." She looked at the room, the people, the piano, the lit hall. "I'm back. I plan to stay." The applause was warm, and no one felt the need to say anything more. Clara walked home through the October village after the concert. The night was clear and cool, stars visible above the church tower, the lime trees rustling their last leaves in the slight breeze. From somewhere behind her she could still hear voices, people leaving the hall, talking in the car park, the particular warm noise of an evening that has gone well and people are reluctant to let end. She walked slowly, not in a hurry, listening to the village settling into its night. She thought about the piano, sitting in the village hall where it had been for a year now, the slight wearing on the most used keys, the bench adjusted by successive players, the music stand beside it that had become permanent, a 101-year-old piano used again, making the sound it was built to make, doing what it was for. She stood and listened to the street for a while before going inside. She thought about what the case had taught her, not about investigations, but about gifts, about the courage of giving something without first establishing it will be welcome, the difference between waiting until you are certain and simply beginning. Harriet had not waited. She had brought a piano to a village in the dark, and hoped, and the village had done what villages do with good things that arrive. It had kept them. Thank you for visiting Willowbrook tonight, and for following Clara as she traced a mysterious piano back to the musician who brought it home. Sometimes the best way to return somewhere is to lead with a gift. Sometimes the bravest thing is to begin before you know how it will be received. And sometimes a village hall piano, played on a Friday evening, is exactly the reason a place needs to become fully itself again. May you rest tonight with the sound of music still in your mind, warm and unhurried, moving through a lit village hall into the autumn dark. May you think of something you have been meaning to begin and feel a little braver about beginning it. And may you remember that the things worth coming back to are worth coming back to at any time, and the welcome is usually warmer than you feared. Rest well, dear friend. Until we meet again in Willowbrook. Good night.